Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Genesis chapters 25 through 50. We start this section by looking at the birth of Jacob and Esau, and of course our focus is going to be mostly upon Jacob, even though the twins are born. And when Jacob is born, he is actually holding on to the heel of his older twin brother Esau. And that's a bit of a humorous statement because they have had an ancient expression, just like we have an expression today. Today we speak about somebody pulling your leg, and back then, if you held to somebody's heel, what we would call a heel grabber, that was a euphemism to describe somebody who was a trickster, a cheat, a con artist. And so Jacob is given the name Jacob, which means heel, and it has a double meaning, both because he was holding on to his brother's heel, but also because a heel is somebody who was a trickster, a cheat, a con artist. And Jacob's name has both meanings. Now, we have an interlude that comes up in Genesis chapter 26 that reminds us of those Abraham-Sarah stories where Abraham had said of Sarah, "She's not my wife, she's my sister." And the same sort of thing takes place in Genesis chapter 6, where it's Rebekah now who is in a foreign palace. And at the end of the day, she's returned to Isaac, and there is a pact with the foreigners, and everything turns out well. But that's almost given by way of an interlude between the Jacob narrative, where we see Jacob born, and the next section where Jacob is now getting a bit older. And so we read then in Genesis chapter 27 about how Jacob steals, tricks, I'm going to say both steal, tricks, cheats his brother out of the family blessing. Jacob had managed to sort of con Esau already out of the birthright. That was through the purchase of a bowl of stew. But now when it comes time for Isaac to bless his oldest son, Jacob, at the instigation of his mother, dons I guess we could call it a Esau uniform, a Esau disguise. He dresses up like a goat, which tells me just about how hairy Esau was, and his blind father Isaac is unable to distinguish between the two. He says, you sound a bit like Esau, but you feel and you smell like, or you sound like Jacob, you feel and smell like Esau. And so Jacob receives the blessing, and when Esau hears about it, Esau is just fit to be tied, and Jacob has to leave town in a hurry. So Jacob leaves town, and the next section we see in Exodus chapter 28, Jacob is on his way to a foreign country. He's had to leave Canaan, and he's going back to Haran. And on his way, he has an encounter with God, a vision of a heavenly ladder, a ladder reaching from earth to heaven, and Jacob receives a promise from God. God says, you go ahead, you're leaving the promised land, but that's okay. You go, and I will go with you. And Jacob names that place Bethel, the house of God. And Jacob promises, Lord, if you go with me and if you bring me back, I'm going to worship you. Again, you wonder about Jacob's his business dealings, his bargaining, even with God. So now Jacob leaves the promised land, and he returns to Haran, that place of his grandfather's origins. And Abraham hadn't been born there, but Abraham had lived there for a time, and Abraham's extended family lives there. And so Jacob is coming back to Haran, and when he comes there, he meets his bride-to-be, I should say. He meets Rachel, and he falls head over heels in love with Rachel. So he arrives in Haran, he meets Rachel. There's a problem, though, and that's that Rachel has an older sister, Leah. And Jacob agrees to work for Rachel, but then at the last minute, at the wedding, Rachel's father, Laban, who was a bit of a trickster himself, a bit of a deceiver, a bit of a con artist himself, he switches brides, and Jacob doesn't find out about it until later, after he's already consummated the marriage. And Jacob finds out that he has married Leah. Now, Rachel is described in the biblical text as having been beautiful. Leah, not so much. In fact, she's described in the biblical text, literally the Hebrew says that her eyes were weak. And I'm not sure if that means that she was a bit of an eyesore, or it means maybe her vision wasn't very good, maybe cross-eyed or something like that. But you get the idea that she's not as beautiful as Rachel. And so Jacob has worked and yet received Leah as his wife, and now through the negotiations with Uncle Laban, Jacob agrees to work now for Rachel for another 7 years. He worked 7 years for Leah, another 7 years, and now he takes Rachel also as wife. So he has these two sisters to whom he is married. And in chapters 29 and 30, we see each of these two sisters. Well, first Leah is the one who has, son after son after son, and Rachel is barren. Rachel, the beloved, is unable to have children, whereas Leah is having children. And then after a while, both Rachel and Leah give their handmaidens in the same way that Hagar had been given to Abraham. So also Leah and Rachel are giving their handmaidens to Jacob to have children by them as well. So Jacob's wives, first Leah, and eventually Rachel too finally has a son, and that son's going to be Joseph. Now, in the latter part of chapter 30, after Jacob has worked for 7 years for Leah, and although that wasn't the one he wanted, and then 7 years for Rachel, now Jacob works a number of more years for Laban, and this time it is for possession of certain elements of the flock. And they make a deal, and the deal is that any spotted sheep, spotted goats, spotted parts of the flock will be given to Jacob. And Jacob is trying to figure out ways to make more of the sheep and the cattle to be spotted so that he can take those for himself. And meanwhile, Laban is changing the deal, changing the wages, and these two are they sort of deserve each other. They're going round and round, but God blesses Jacob so that indeed a greater number of the flocks and herds do become his, and he has managed to out-con the con artist, his father-in-law Laban. It's not a very pretty picture. And the thing we ought to keep in mind is that the hero of the story isn't really Jacob. It's certainly not Laban. The hero of the story is God, who is bringing about his will in this very dysfunctional family. In chapter 31, Jacob realizes that he's a bit on the outs with his father-in-law. He's worn out his welcome, and he gathers up his family, and he runs secretly from Haran. He's heading back to Canaan. He's trying to escape his father-in-law. And we read in Genesis chapter 31, verse 19, that when Laban had gone to shear his flock, then Rachel stole the household idols that were her father's. And so not only is Jacob fleeing, but his beloved Rachel, in the midst of that flight, has stolen the property of Laban. Now, what did she want with household idols? We're not really told. Was this a worship thing? She wanted to worship these false gods? Was she just merely trying to sort of get back at her father? Or have some scholars suggested this might be a case where those household idols actually were used as a form of the formal deed for certain possessions that were owned by Laban. So there might be a financial issue here. We're not told in the biblical text if this is the case or not. But Rachel steals these household idols. And Laban comes in Genesis chapter 31, verse 31. Laban has caught up to Jacob and said, "Why did you run?" And Jacob replied to Laban, "Because I was afraid, for I thought that you would take your daughters from me by force. The one with whom you find your gods," because Laban says, "Why have you taken my household idols? Why have you taken my gods?" And Jacob says, "The one with whom you find your gods shall not live," because Jacob doesn't know that his beloved Rachel has stolen those. And so Jacob puts a curse upon the thief, whoever that thief might be, and he says, "The one with whom you find your gods shall not live. In the presence of our kinsmen, point out what is yours among my belongings and take it for yourself." And they were told outright, for Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. Now Rachel, meanwhile, had taken the household idols, the Hebrew word there is the teraphim, these household idols, and put them in the camel's saddle. And she sat on them. And Laban, meanwhile, is going through. He says, felt through all the tent, but did not find them. And she said to her father, let not my Lord be angry that I cannot rise before you, for the manner of woman is upon me. It's that time of the month. So he searched, but did not find the household idols. So Rachel gets away with it, but there's a sense in which a curse has been put on her. And I don't think it's happenstance that when they get back to the promised land, Rachel will have a second son, Benjamin, and she will die in childbirth, perhaps in fulfillment of that family curse that Jacob has put unknowingly on her, upon whoever was the thief of those household idols. Jacob finally makes it back to the promised land. He's coming down near to a small river that flows into the Jordan that we've marked out on our map. That river is known as the Jabbok. That means to Jabbok is to wrestle. So this is the river of wrestling. And it gets its story from the event that takes place here, where Jacob is coming into the land and he hears that his brother Esau is coming out to meet him. And he says, oh, that's nice. Esau's coming out to meet me. But Esau's coming with 400 mounted warriors. And that doesn't sound very promising at all. And Jacob is getting very worried, and so Jacob sends all sorts of gifts ahead to meet Esau, maybe to sort of buy him off and assuage the anger that Esau might be feeling for him after all these many, many, many years where Jacob's been out of the land. And then he separates his family and sends Leah and those children on up ahead, and Rachel a little bit further. And Jacob he's the very end of the procession, and Jacob is now by himself. Here we are by the Jabbok River. Jacob is by himself with Esau on his way, and he doesn't know what to expect. And we read in Genesis chapter 32 that Jacob has an encounter, not with Esau, that will come in the following chapter, but Jacob has an encounter with God. Actually, it's an angel that comes. And we read in Genesis 32 verse 24, then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. This unknown person shows up, and when he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh. That is, Jacob's thigh is touched by this unknown man, this one who elsewhere is called an angel. He touched the socket of his thigh so that the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. You know, I've never had a dislocated thigh. I have dislocated a thumb, and man, I have to tell you, that was painful. And those who have suffered dislocations, either of a shoulder or a thigh, a leg out of joint, that is incredibly painful. And in spite of this intense pain, it had to be intense, Jacob won't give up. And he said, that is the man that's wrestling with Jacob, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But he said, Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Jacob has been holding on for dear life. He's holding on, and what he really wants, the same thing that he wanted when Isaac was deceived, the same thing that he wanted when he tricked Esau out of the birthright, I will not let you go unless you bless me. He's after a blessing. So he said to him, what is your name? And here that comes out. He said, Jacob, heel grabber, deceiver, trickster. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but instead Israel, for you have, in the passage says, striven with God. The Hebrew says, you have Israel with El. El is the shortened form for Elohim, God. And Israel is to strive. So Israel means God's striver, God wrestler. You have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. And then Jacob asked him and said, please tell me your name. But he said, why is it you asked me my name? And he blessed him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, your pen is your face in Hebrew. El, we just said, is a shortened form for God. So Peniel is the face of God. For he said, I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been preserved. Now, the next day, Jacob, comes back and he meets Esau. He's been afraid of Esau, but when he finally meets Esau, it's almost anticlimactic, and Esau's fine with him, and they're sort of back together. So notice how we've had in our storyline back in chapter 27, we had Jacob fearing Esau and fleeing, but now Esau returns, and fearing Esau is no longer that big of an issue. And again, we have an interlude as we're now back in the land, and this time the interlude deals not with Rebekah in a foreign palace, but instead the daughter of Jacob, Dinah, who meets up with a foreign Canaanite, and she's actually raped. It's not a pretty picture. Now, to be fair, the fellow who does this, he says, I'd like to make good on this. I'd like to marry her. And Jacob agrees, but two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, go in, and when those in the city have agreed to join the Israelites and even be circumcised, and that has sort of taken the population, put them on the sick list, at least for a time. Simeon and Levi go in and they massacre, they murder everyone in town. And so it's a picture that's not a very pretty picture. And that interlude comes to an end, and finally we have the death of both Rebekah's nurse, after which again we see, now Jacob's already been given the name Israel, but that's given again in a summary statement where God says your name in Israel is Israel. So the death of Rebekah's nurse, but also a bit later in that chapter, the death of Rachel, the beloved of Jacob. So we have not one death but two deaths, as opposed to two births, and also the naming of Israel, and that sort of brings us full circle. Jacob had been named back in Genesis chapter 25. Now he is given the name Israel in chapter 35, even though that's a summary statement. Next, we want to look at the Joseph story. And right at the outset, the problem in the Joseph story was a problem of favoritism, where Joseph was Jacob's favorite, even though he was one of the younger sons. In fact, as he's born, he's the very youngest, and he has older brothers that are sons to either the handmaiden of Rachel or the handmaiden of Leah, or of Leah herself. So Joseph is youngest, and this youngest favored one is given a coat of many colors. Some translations say a coat with sleeves, and it could have been whatever it was. We could call it the foreman's jacket. And he's given a coat to designate that he's the favored son, and that just makes the older brothers hate him the more. And what's more, Joseph has dreams, and his dreams signify this future relationship where Joseph he dreams that the sun, moon, and stars, and he specifies there's 10 stars that are bowing down to him, or 11 stars. That is his brothers, and they get the point of it, that it signifies Jacob and Leah, or I'm sorry, Jacob and his mother and mothers, the mothers in the family, and the sons all bowing down to Joseph. And they get the point, that not only is he receiving this jacket, he's dreaming dreams, and probably not too bright to tell everybody about the dreams, but that's what he's doing. And so Joseph is hated by his brothers. And the brothers take Joseph when they're all away from home, and they initially are thinking about murdering him, and they're talked out of it. They decide, well, instead we'll throw him into a pit, and eventually they take him out of the pit and they sell him into slavery. And then they take that hated coat of many colors and they bring about a deception. That is, they take the garment and they tear it up a bit, and then they stain it with the blood of a slain goat. and they bring it back to Father Jacob, and they say, "Look what we found. Doesn't this look familiar?" And he recognizes it, of course. It's the present that he gave his beloved son Joseph. And they said, "We found this." So that Jacob is being deceived with these garments and with the blood of a goat in the same way that he had deceived his father Isaac with goat skins. Remember how he dressed up like Esau? He, tried to smell like Esau, tried to feel like his hairy brother Esau. And so he's deceived the same way. And it's coming back to haunt him. He's being deceived by his own sons the same way he had deceived his father. And so Joseph is taken from the land. He's sold to some traveling Midianites who take him down to Egypt, and he is sold as a slave, and he finds himself in Egypt. Now, Egypt in the days of Joseph was in what we call the Middle Kingdom period. That is, this is long after the age of the pyramids. The pyramids were the old kingdom. And then Egypt had gone through some troubled times, what we call the First Intermediate period. And now that Egypt is in this Middle Kingdom period, Egypt is doing very well financially. It's one of the superpowers. And Joseph finds himself in Egypt. And Joseph initially is a slave sold to the house of Potiphar. Potiphar was the captain of the guard of Pharaoh's prison. And Joseph rises in favor of Potiphar, who looks at this young slave and says, gee, he's got a lot going for him. And eventually Joseph is put in charge of all that Pharaoh has. But Joseph's eventually also catches the eye of Potiphar's wife. And Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph. He won't have any of it, but she is scorned. And there's an old saying about hell has no fury like a woman scorned. And she lies about Joseph, accuses him of having tried to rape her. And Potiphar believes the story, as I assume, and acts as though Joseph is really guilty and takes Joseph and casts him into prison. So not only now is he a slave, but he's a slave in prison, and as a slave in prison, he's actually made a prisoner of some VIP slaves. The Pharaoh's cupbearer and the Pharaoh's baker have both been imprisoned, and Joseph is made a slave to them. So he's not only in prison, but he's down on the bottom of the pecking order in prison. He's a slave in prison, and as he is their slave, they each have dreams. Now remember, at the start of the Joseph story, we had him having dreams, but now the baker and the cupbearer each have dreams, and Joseph interprets their dreams and says to the cupbearer, your dream signifies that you're going to be returned to your status, and he says to the baker, you're going to be released from prison too, but it's going to be an execution. You're going to have your head removed from your shoulders. And both of those take place, and before they take place, Joseph says to the cupbearer, remember me when you get out. And the cupbearer, of course, he gets out of prison, he's restored, but he forgets all about Joseph. And that happens, well, for a time. Let me pause for a second and just notice some of the contrast that we've been having. I borrowed this from a fellow in our church by the name of George Sayer. I think he did a delightful job of showing this pattern. We have noticed Jacob's exodus contrasted with Joseph's exodus. Jacob had been sent on his journey by his father. Joseph, remember when he first went to check on his brothers, leading up to that time when he was sold into slavery, was sent on a journey by his fathers. In Jacob's, I'm going to call it Jacob's exodus, the Lord tells Jacob that he will be with him, and that place where Jacob had named the place Bethel at the vision of Jacob's ladder. We read in Genesis chapter 39, verse 2, that the Lord was with Joseph. In Jacob's story, Jacob asks the strangers where his uncle is, and he finally meets up with Rachel and then with Laban. And Joseph asks strangers where the brothers are. So there's a little bit of a pattern here. In Jacob's exodus, Jacob's brothers, his single brother Esau, hates him and intends to kill him. Now we can say for good reason, because Jacob had been a bit of a cheat and a liar. In the Joseph story, Joseph's brothers hate him and intend to kill him, not necessarily because he had done anything wrong, maybe ill-advised to share all those dreams and brag about it, but really more because of favoritism his father had shown. In the Jacob story, Jacob was treated unfairly by Laban. Now Joseph is treated unfairly by Potiphar's wife. In the Jacob story, Jacob had found himself second in charge to Laban. In the Joseph story, Joseph had become second in charge to Potiphar. In the Jacob story, Laban had admitted that he was blessed on Jacob's account, and Potiphar likewise had seen that he was blessed on Joseph's account. And in both stories, the real hero isn't Jacob, the real hero isn't Joseph, the real hero is God, because it's showing that God is in control of all of these things. Now, Joseph, we left him in prison, and he'd been in prison and then forgotten by the cupbearer who had been returned. And it's not until the Pharaoh has a dream. And the Pharaoh's dream, in the Pharaoh dreams, he's troubled by it. And if the Pharaoh's troubled, everybody's troubled by it. And it's now that the cupbearer says, oh yeah, dreams. I remember back when this fellow Joseph had interpreted my dream. Maybe he will be able to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams. And so Joseph is released. He's brought before the Pharaoh. And Joseph correctly interprets the Pharaoh's dreams as a warning from God. And these dreams indicate that there have been some really good times right now that are going through Egypt. Egypt is in an economic boom, and things are going great. But the rest of the dream tells us there's going to be 7 years of these good years, but they will be followed by 7 very harsh years, 7 years of economic depression when famine come upon the land. And so Joseph says, because of these dreams, what you ought to do, you've got some really good financial times, take all that money on all that food and put it away for those 7 tough years that are coming up around the corner. And the Pharaoh is so impressed with Joseph's advice, the Pharaoh says, that's first of all, that's great that you were able to interpret the dreams, but it's really wonderful that you were able to give good financial advice. Such good advice, I'm going to take you and I'm going to make you in charge of all of that. And Joseph is exalted to be the number 2 man in all of Egypt. Now notice how we've had this series of where a promise is given, and this is going all the way back to the days of Abraham. Abraham had been given a promise that his descendants would be a multitude. And yet when we were looking at the Abraham story, he and Sarah had both been, she had been barren, and they were both advanced in years, so they were both old, not really doing a lot of childbearing things. And when the fulfillment had come, it hadn't been merely at the hands of Hagar, but it had been Isaac, a son born to their old age, a son born to the one who is barren. So promise what looks like a defeat and then a supernatural fulfillment. The same thing took place in the Jacob story, where Jacob, the announcement had been made even before he was born that the older will serve the younger. And so it was Jacob who had been promised from God that he would be given rule over the land. And yet it looked like it would be a defeat where he has to leave Canaan and go and live in Haran. And even in Haran, he's sort of under the thumb of his father-in-law Laban. He becomes a fugitive in Haran, but the fulfillment comes when he returns now, and he returns with great wealth that God has provided. Yes, Jacob has tried to do his trickster thing, but it's God who has provided and God who has blessed him. So now again, Joseph had been given these dreams. They supposedly come from God, that your family will bow down to you, and yet it looked like it would be defeated where Joseph is he's sold into slavery, he becomes a slave, and then a slave in the prison of a foreign superpower. It goes as low as you could possibly go, and yet in a single day, he's raised up to become second in all of Egypt. This same pattern, by the way, is going to continue in our Old Testament survey. We're going to see next week Moses, who gets the idea at an early stage that you're going to lead your country out of bondage. And then at the opportunity where Moses sees perhaps, this is the time, Moses sees an injustice taking place, and Moses kills a taskmaster who is beating on an Israelite. And when the Israelites see him, they reject him. They say, who do you think you are? You're just a murderer. And he's rejected by the Israelites and forced to flee. And he becomes a fugitive in the land of Midian for 40 years. But it's then after that time that the Lord appears to him in the burning bush. And he goes back to Egypt according to the will of the Lord, according to the command of God, and he leads Israel out of Egypt through the Red Sea in a way nobody imagined. So we have the promise, what looks like a defeat, and then the supernatural fulfillment that takes place. Of course, the wonderful culmination of the same process is seen in the person of Jesus, who comes upon the scene proclaiming the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and it looks like here's the king who's bringing the kingdom. And then what looks like the defeat, where the king is crucified, dead, and buried, his disciples are scattered. You come to the end of the Gospels, and it looks like it's all fallen apart. But then we have the resurrection of the king, his ascension into heaven, and as we get into the book of Acts, the giving of the Holy Spirit, which serves as the impetus, as the power to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth. So we have both promise, what looks like a defeat, but really is victory, and then the supernatural fulfillment of resurrection, ascension, and here we are today, 2,000 years later, and the kingdom has been spread throughout the entire world. Now let's go back to the Joseph story. In the Joseph story, Joseph has been exalted, and his brothers come into the land because now as the famine really kicks in, the only place that has food, that has things to share, is Egypt because of Joseph's preparation. And the brothers of Joseph come into the land because, frankly, they're hungry. They're getting ready to starve, and they're looking for a place where they can get some food. And they come before Joseph, and they don't recognize Joseph. You ever go to one of those high school or college reunions, and you see all these old people there. Well, they come before Joseph, and they had last seen Joseph, he was a teenager, and now he's a grown adult, and what's more, he's probably sort of dressed like an Egyptian and walking and talking like an Egyptian. It looks like and they don't expect to see him there, so they don't recognize him. But he recognizes them, and he puts them to the test to see if there has been a change in their life. And he initially accuses them of being spies, and just so he can sort of play along with them, and they say, oh, we're not spies, we actually have a younger brother, we live in the land of Canaan. And he says, well, you're going to have to prove it to me. Go get your younger brother. He holds one of them hostage. Go get your younger brother and bring him back. And they go back to Jacob, and they tell Jacob this terrible story about how the ruler of the land of Egypt has been suspecting them of espionage, and they have to go back, and Jacob doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to lose still another of his favorite sons. He doesn't want to lose Benjamin, but eventually, just because things are so bad, they have to go back, and they come back with Benjamin. And now Joseph sets up the storyline so that it looks like Benjamin has stolen something. Benjamin hasn't. And Benjamin is going to be taken and enslaved. And the older brothers have the opportunity to sit back and let it happen, just as they did with Joseph. And Joseph, they were actually the instigators. But they have the opportunity to throw their younger brother under the bus, or they can stand up for him. And that's what takes place. Judah, he's not the oldest, but he's sort of the instigator. He's sort of the leader. And Judah offers himself as a sacrifice in place of Benjamin. And now Joseph reveals himself to his brothers and says, look, I forgive you, and now all of the tribe, and go get dad, Jacob/Israel, and Israel, that is Jacob, and the entire family, the entire clan, come down into Egypt. Now what's happening here, Joseph is manipulating his brothers in order to bring the family back together, not just physically, but spiritually. And as we read about this, remember Moses is the author, as Moses writes this narrative, God is doing exactly the same thing to the nation of Israel. He is putting Israel through the Red Sea, through the Sinai wilderness, through, bringing them to the promised land, but really to do the same thing, not to just bring them into the promised land physically, but to bring them back spiritually as well. And that begs the question, what is God doing in your life today to bring you closer to himself? Because God is at work in your life to bring you to him, not just physically, but spiritually. Now, I want to look at the pattern of Israel's purpose. There's been a pattern that's been taking place all throughout, from Abraham all the way down now to the sons of Jacob. First of all, we noted back when Abraham came into the land that he would build an altar and he would worship the Lord. The way this is phrased, it says he built an altar and he called upon the name of the Lord. And then he went down to Egypt. Remember with that, she's not my wife, she is my sister. But he came back into the land, and he came back and he built an altar and he called upon the name of the Lord. And then he'd go maybe to another place and he built an altar and he called upon the name of the Lord. And we would see that pattern. Both he and Isaac, now that we don't have a lot about Isaac, but Isaac builds an altar and calls upon the name of the Lord. Jacob, once he gets back into the land after running away to Haran, no altars there, but eventually coming back, and eventually Jacob too comes back into the land and he builds an altar and he calls upon the name of the Lord. But we never read that happening with the sons of Jacob. It's as though they're forgetting their purpose. They're losing that sense of purpose, of identity, of calling to be the special people that God has called them to be. They're showing a lack of unity. In fact, what they are beginning to do, they're beginning to intermarry with the Canaanites. Judah has his son marry to Tamar, and it's not that she's bad. In fact, she's actually mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. But they're beginning to forget that they're called to be a special people. And so there's a growing lack of racial and religious purity, and so God takes them out of the land of Canaan, where there's Canaanites who are always saying, hey, let's, your daughters will marry our sons and vice versa, and we'll all be happy Canaanites together. And instead of that, God brings them down into Egypt, where the Egyptians will largely have nothing to do with the Israelites, because, first of all, those Israelites are nasty old shepherds, and we don't really care for shepherds anyway. And then they're nasty old Semitic peoples, and we don't really want to intermarry with them. And so you have them brought into Egypt, where there will be a forced segregation. They will force to be racially, somewhat at least, and religiously pure, as God grows here the nation of Israel for the next 400 years. We come to Genesis chapter 48, and Joseph has two sons. They are Ephraim and Manasseh, and a pattern that we've seen so much, now that it's started to become a pattern, Joseph brings his sons to be blessed by Jacob, and he carefully orchestrates it where the older Manasseh, the older one, is there on Jacob's right hand, where he might have the right hand of blessing, the strong hand of blessing, and Ephraim is over here on the left because he's the younger one. And as Jacob reaches out to bless them, Jacob crosses his hands to indicate, yes, I'm going to bless them, but the chief blessing, the right hand blessing, goes upon the younger, not upon the older. And Joseph doesn't really care for that, even though Joseph himself was one of the younger ones who was blessed by God. And yet there's a pattern here where the younger receives the blessing instead of the older. It reminds us that we have an older brother who has given us his blessing. Jesus Christ has blessed us, has given us his inheritance, and we receive that in Christ. So this younger brother motif, we had Seth instead of Cain, we had Isaac instead of Ishmael, we had Jacob instead of Esau, we have, and I didn't really mention that, Perez instead of Zerah. That was two sons of Judah. We have Ephraim instead of Manasseh. And as I said, we have an older brother who has given us his inheritance. We are heirs in Christ Jesus.